Hello, world history students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video about the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about the causes and the effects of the Industrial Revolution and, what the Industrial Revolution is. Industrialization is a change in economic activities. It's a change that has happened in many countries around the world. And as part of this change, so before the change, a country makes basic primary goods, usually by hand or using very simple tools. This usually happens in somebody's house. It's called a cottage industry because you're working outside of your home or your cottage, which nobody calls it that anymore, but that's what it used to be called. So before industrialization, most people in a society are going to be farming, and the people who are making things are going to be doing it by hand. Industrialization changes a country. During industrialization, factories are built, usually in cities, and those factories provide people with jobs, mass producing goods, so making lots and lots of a thing. That's what mass producing means, making lots of it. And then those goods are then ready for consumption or being bought and sold. Whenever a country industrializes, you end up with a lot more people moving to cities to work these factory jobs. And you end up with a lot fewer people living in the country doing the agricultural work. So industrialization is all about taking raw materials or natural resources and turning them into manufactured goods. Like this example here, we have the raw material of wood or lumber being turned into paper. It's being fed through machines, different machines, one that takes the bark off, ones that grind the wood up, some that that drive the water out of the pulp, press it down, and finally turn it into paper. So the paper becomes the manufactured good, which is then able to be sold. And this is just one example, of course. There's machines that make all kinds of different things. So the Industrial Revolution began in England in 1750, around 1750. And there's a variety of reasons why that happened. One reason is that England had the natural resources that you need for an industrial revolution during this time period. Coal and iron were both in the ground in England, relatively close to the surface, and so they were able to be mined relatively easily. Coal is really important because you can burn it as a source of energy, and iron is important because it's a metal that would be used to make buildings and machines and railroad tracks and everything else. And then water is important because water is used to make steam, and the steam engine, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, relies on sources of water in order to be able to expand and work. I'm sorry, I had a moment there. Okay. Another reason why England industrialized first was because it had colonies. Colonies are really important to industrialization because they provide a mother country with natural resources. It's not fair. It's not a good way to go about getting your natural resources, but England had these colonies in America that provided it with tons of natural resources, and they could take those natural resources out of the colonies and send them back to England. And then once they had made the manufactured goods in the factories in England, they could then ship them back to the colonies and sell them to the people who lived there. So you're taking out the natural resources, buying them cheap, and then you're selling back finished goods, which are much more expensive. And that's a process that happens throughout history with colonies. It's part of mercantilism. Okay, so another thing that helped industrialization happen in England is called the enclosure movement. For a long time in England, there were these open tracts of land, green pastures called the commons. And it was a place where anybody who lived in a particular town or county, whatever, could use that land to do their agricultural work. If they had like a herd of animals, they could feed on the pasture in that land. And then around this time period, they started to fence off the land. They started to shut down the commons, close the commons off, enclose it, if you will. They would put up fences and keep the poor people out. And so now poor people have no more access to that land, and they have no way to do the work that they've been doing. And they're jobless. They need a job. And so that's going to lead them to move to the cities looking for work. They're going to end up working in factories. Another cause of the Industrial Revolution is the perfection of the steam engine by James Watt. The steam engine was originally designed to help mine coal. When you're mining coal, you're going to have groundwater that's going to start to accumulate in the mine. And so the steam engine was built as a way to pump the water out of the bottom of the mine and make mining the coal easier. As time went on, they realized that the steam engine had many, many other uses, and it would be used as part of railroads, and it would be used in the machinery in factories that really helped the Industrial Revolution to really take off. The Industrial Revolution would diffuse or spread to many different places. It started in England, but then by the middle of the 1800s, it had spread to France and Germany and other places in Central Europe, and it spread further in the late 1800s to places like Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. It would also spread to the United States. And, the success of industrialization in the United States is one of the things that made the United States a really successful country economically and militarily later in the 20th century. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So one thing is that population exploded because of the Industrial Revolution. It took, in the year 1700, before industrialization, this is just figures for Great Britain. There were 5 million people in Great Britain in 1700. Industrialization happened about the middle of that century. By 1800, there were 9 million people living there. And you can see that the world population, it took until about 1900 for the world population to reach 1 billion people. And then because of industrialization and because of the economic changes that industrialization brings, now the world population is close to 9 billion people, close to 8 billion people. Population has been increasing exponentially because of the Industrial Revolution. Because of industrialization, there's a better standard of living. People have more access to cheaper products. Products are able to be made cheaply in factories because they're being made, so many of them at a time. It's called an economy of scale. The more you make of something, the cheaper you can make it. And so that means people can buy more stuff with the money that they're making. There's going to be better transportation because of industrialization, particularly the railroads. They start building steamships and canals that help people to travel, and they start building automobiles eventually. All of these things really shrink the world. I mean, not literally, the world didn't get smaller, but for people, it felt like it did, right? Because if the only way you can get from one place to another is by walking or riding a horse, it means that you can't go as many places. And that when you go somewhere, when you do travel, it's going to take a really long time. But now, if you want to go visit somebody who lives on the other side of the country, you can buy a ticket and you can ride a train, and it'll be much, much faster and safer and easier for you to do that. So it makes the world feel like a smaller place and saves people a lot of time. Urbanization is another effect of industrialization. Because the factories are in cities, it leads to the growth of cities. And that's what urbanization means. It means cities becoming more important and more people moving to cities and more of daily life taking place in cities. It also meant that cities became very crowded, and you ended up with really unpleasant living situations in many places. This is not a desirable living situation. These shabby, rundown apartments that are not particularly safe or clean are called tenements. And, there wasn't a whole lot of space, and people were just cramming in there trying to have any kind of room for a bed that they could find. Another effect of industrialization was environmental pollution. All that burning of all that coal, which was a huge part of the Industrial Revolution, led to lots of air pollution. It made it harder for people to breathe. It meant that people were more likely to get sick. Water pollution also became a huge factor, with factories dumping chemicals into the water. And so then you end up with sanitation issues where people can't drink water safely anymore. Another effect of industrialization is that there are more people being educated. So the Peel's Factory Act of 1822 said that an employer needs to provide education and reading, writing, and arithmetic part of the workday. The workday was started at 6 a.m. and went until 9 p.m., which is kind of bananas. Another effect of industrialization was really poor working conditions. People felt like the owners of the factories had a huge effect on their ability to be happy and to live a life that they wanted to live. Factory owners beat children who worked there. I mean, there was child labor was a thing. And then, if a kid didn't do a good job, factory owners would beat them. Everybody who worked in a factory would work 12 plus hours a day, usually like 6 days a week. The only day you got off was Sunday. And a lot of these factories were incredibly dangerous. The machines were not particularly safe to use. You could end up being injured or maimed, and the pay wasn't particularly good. So, it was not exactly a fun life. On the other hand, the middle class begins to grow, which means there are more people who are escaping poverty and becoming reasonably successful and being able to and provide for themselves and not live in those kinds of circumstances. There's still more poor people than there are middle class people, but there's more middle class people than there ever had been before. So those are some of the causes and some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. It's by no means a complete list, but those are the important ones that we are focusing on. Please make sure that you answer the summary question, and thank you for watching. I'll talk to you next time.